In late November, thousands of Ukrainians poured onto the streets of the capital city of Kiev in a bid to urge President Viktor Yanukovych to reconsider his government's decision to cancel a partnership deal with the European Union. But Yanukovych refused, and now, more than 2 weeks later, protesters still line the streets, now calling for the president and his government to resign. Joining us now for more on what's behind the protests and what is next for the Eastern European country, Taras Kuzio. He is research associate at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and Marc Shwec. He is former president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress's Toronto branch. Gentlemen, good to have both of you here tonight. For a story I know both of you are watching very carefully. I want to read an excerpt here of what was in the agreement, a summation actually of what was in the agreement that has been rejected, and then we'll come back and chat from that. So, control room, if we could, please. An association agreement is the European Union's main instrument to bring the countries in the Eastern Partnership closer to EU standards and norms. It comprises 4 general chapters: common foreign and security policy, justice and home affairs, the deep and comprehensive free trade area, and a 4th chapter covering a range of issues including the environment, science, transportation, and education. In signing this, Eastern Partnership members will be committing themselves to adopting specific pieces of EU legislation in trade, consumer protection, and environmental regulation. Countries that sign a DC FTA must adopt some 350 EU laws within a 10-year time frame. Signatories of a DC FTA will also have access to the EU's 500 million consumers and a market with a combined economy of 12.9 trillion euros. By way of comparison, the rival Russian-led union, Customs Union, has just 170 million consumers and a combined economy of 1.4 trillion euros. They're making it sound very good. In which case, Marc, let's start with you. Why did Yanukovych reject this deal?
Well, we can only speculate, but just days before the deal should have been signed, he traveled to Russia and clearly got a better deal. We can't say what's on the table, but we clearly know that he had worked for months with his team in Europe. In all of the capitals, all of the presidents, all of the ministers were working together across Europe to shore up Ukraine's support. Initially, it was lukewarm. It grew with time, and all of a sudden, everybody was on board. There was a stumbling block of Yulia Tymoshenko sitting in prison for her freedom.
This is the former candidate for president, and she's been in jail for how long now?
I think it's 2 years now. Yeah.
Okay.
So you know, it was an important point that everybody wanted her free as part of the deal. They were starting to wane on it and starting to look at, you know, we'll cut you a deal, we'll soften the edges around the deal as long as you sign, get into the European Union. Depending who you spoke to, those deals were at different levels or different softening, if you will. Poland was a great supporter of Ukraine's. They clearly want Ukraine on board. Everybody wanted Ukraine on board. Yanukovych had his whole team going and then cuts the deal, changes the deal just a couple of days before and cuts the deal with Putin.
Do you agree with that interpretation?
Not completely, no. I think it's wrong to actually use the Russian argument, which is what President Yanukovych has done. He's blamed it on Russian trade blockade. If that was completely true, then small countries such as Moldova and Georgia, with big chunks of their territories occupied by Russia for 20 years now, would have not signed the agreements. They went ahead and signed. Ukraine didn't. They're under also severe trade blockades. The key factors behind this are Yanukovych's domestic issues. And there are 3 factors that guide him in domestic and foreign policy: to become the wealthiest person in Ukraine, the most powerful, and to stay in power as long as possible. And everything else is incidental. I was in Kiev in early November, and an expert there told me it was always wrong to view Viktor Yanukovych as pro-Russian. And it's also wrong to view him as pro-European. He said this a month ago.
He's pro himself.
He's pro himself, exactly.
But it's a heck of a coincidence that his trip to Russia is immediately followed by the Xing of this agreement.
Of course, but he was convinced, he was absolutely convinced, and this is where the Tymoshenko case comes in, and what Marc was talking about, he was absolutely convinced that the EU was bluffing, that the EU would sign the agreement for geopolitical reasons. Ukraine's a big country, wants to get the country inside the European Union, and regardless of whether Tymoshenko was released or not. A week before he realized, it finally dawned on them that the EU wasn't bluffing, that this was really a serious issue, particularly for countries like Germany, because Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, is a Christian Democrat. Tymoshenko's party is in the same political group in the European Parliament. And so he pulled out, blamed the Russian blockade, but really we're talking about he was wondering to what degree all this would affect his re-election chances in 2015. And he's paranoid about Tymoshenko.
Let me follow up on this angle here. It is not frequent that you see 100,000 people take to the streets because of a canceling of a trade agreement, which is essentially, at the end of the day, I know it's obviously, there's a lot more than just a trade agreement here, but why has that happened?
Well, a couple things. One is the people of Ukraine are just dying to have some sort of civil society that they can live in. I mean, it's not completely anarchical there. Anarchy is present in terms of heavy corruption. But in Ukraine, people want civil society. They're looking to have a judicial system that works. They're looking for police to work. They're looking for the courts to work, the prosecutors. Everybody's corrupt top to bottom. You can buy just about anything you want. So the average citizen is looking for the protection of Europe to give them some sort of semblance of civil society, good governance, and so on. That's why they want it. They went to the streets and protested. And then when the police attacked these students, even more people came to the street, and they're saying up to 300, 350,000 showed up Sunday.
800, somebody saying.
Yeah, so it's hard to know what the number is. But the people, as soon as you infringe upon their dignity, they come out to the streets in even greater numbers.
Let's do a bit of a bird's eye view here, if we can, of Ukraine, because it's in the news in a way now that allows people to, gives us an opportunity actually to learn a bit more about the country. So let's bring this up if we can. This is a country with a population of about 44.5 million. The growth rate, however, is going in the wrong direction. This is a country whose population is shrinking, according to the latest estimates. The ethnic groups inside Ukraine, almost 80% Ukrainian, a little more than 17% Russian. The median age, about 40 years. Total area, 603,000 square kilometers. It's the second largest in terms of area in that part of the world. The GDP purchasing power parity, $340.7 billion. Natural resources, iron ore, coal, natural gas, oil, arable land. Ukrainians in Canada, that'd be you two, I guess, 1.3 million. Paint us, Taras, if you would, a picture of the average person who is on the street right now protesting. Who are they?
Well, it's a mixture of things. What happened was that you had 3 years of relative passivity since Viktor Yanukovych came to power in 2010. The reason for the passivity and the ability of Yanukovych to get what he wanted without any protests was because of people who were despondent about the Orange Revolution, about the failure of Viktor Yushchenko's presidency in the Orange Revolution. So they were very disillusioned. The EU agreement was the spark that broke the camel's back, the straw that broke the camel's back. And all of these other underlying problems that had been building up under the surface all came out. So yes, this is a pro-European revolution. This is an anti-Soviet revolution. Can you believe it, 20 years on? Because the leaders who are in power were all born in the late 40s. When Stalin was ruling the Soviet Union, they're out of touch with the average Ukrainian. This is also a middle-class revolution. This is young students, middle-class Ukrainians, who are all born, the students and the middle-class people, the professionals and businessmen, were born after 91. They were born in post-Soviet Ukraine.
In which case, who are the people who are still supporting the government?
Well, there are two groups. There are paid provocateurs out on the street, and we can talk about that. There are also paid protesters. It's been documented by Canal 5 or Channel 5 in Ukraine that you can see them being paid to go onto the street, and they get a certain dollar amount to go out every night. So there are paid people. But genuinely, I'll say in eastern Ukraine, there are people who genuinely are scared of Europe. They've been told for years that Europe is a problem area. Eastern Ukraine is a mining area, central Ukraine, where the heavy population base is. And they have jobs as badly as they're paid. They have a job. They're poorly paid. The oligarchs steal the money off the top, sell the product, pocket the money, give the states some money, give the workers even less. But they do have something. Now they're being told, if you go into Europe, you now have to compete. And our factories are old, they're decrepit, they're not modernized, you're going to lose your jobs to machines.
So lots of fear.
They've been scaring people for 20 years about that. So people are scared genuinely.
You were, in 2004, there during the Orange Revolution?
I was.
How did the demonstrations today compare to those back then?
A little bit different. They were organized primarily by the main parties last time, the Orange Revolution people. They had scarves and they had the colors out, and this was well orchestrated. The difference then was the press wasn't free to cover it. It was very scary at first. It was everybody was nervous. As a matter of fact, back then I was telling your producer when I was out there, I was standing on the streets and the first buses started pouring in from Western Ukraine. And the people were coming off, and hundreds of buses just literally lined up down the roads, down the highways. And they were coming back, and they said, 2 days ago, the same policeman who stopped us, now were cheering us on to come in. So society changed at the time. This is a new group to what Taras mentions, middle class, students, people who have internet access, a whole new generation's not afraid of the old Soviet era or that kind of police brutality. They're less fearful, and they're going out on the streets.
Let me do another comparison to back then. If Yulia Tymoshenko were not in jail, but were actually out there, presumably partaking in the protests, how might things be different today?
Yanukovych might be actually potentially running away from office. I mean, she is the best orator in the country, probably the nationalist leader, Oleg Tyanibok, is second. She's a great mobilizer in elections, and she's a revolutionary by her very nature. People are willing to lay down their lives for somebody like her. And she's very unusual. She's a woman in a man's world, in that part of the world. And so the people who are in power, A, they don't know how to deal with her because she's a woman, a very successful, very self-confident woman. They also don't know how to deal with her because she's such a good mobilizer of people. And Viktor Yanukovych expected to win by over 10% in 2010. He barely defeated her when she was a prime minister during a global financial crisis. So he's paranoid about her. And that was one of the main reasons why he couldn't sign the agreement, because the EU was demanding her release. So he was concerned about 2015.
Well, let's do a little more history here, shall we? The Ukrainian-Russian relationship, which has been a complex one over the last century. But let's go back just 20-odd plus years as we look at the relationship here. 1991, of course, independence from the Soviet Union is declared. Canada was, I think, if not the first, certainly one of the first countries to acknowledge Ukraine's independence, Brian Mulroney doing so as PM. 1997, the Friendship Treaty with Russia and the agreement on the Black Sea Fleet. November 2004, the Moscow-backed candidate Viktor Yanukovych, the aforementioned, is declared president after the vote, despite reports of massive fraud. The opposition launches the mass protests dubbed the Orange Revolution, which we've talked about. December 2004, the opposition candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, wins in the revote. Move ahead to 2009, Russia briefly stops gas supplies to Ukraine in a row over pricing. 2010, another presidential election, this time Yanukovych wins. July 2013, Russia restricts imports from Ukraine as Kiev seeks closer ties to the EU. And November 2013, President Yanukovych reverses the decision to sign the EU deal, triggering the mass protests we've been talking about. Now, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who of course was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, once said, without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire, but with Ukraine suborned and then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire. Start us off, Marc. How important is this Ukrainian-Russian relationship?
Well, it's historically important. One can't deny that. I mean, much of Russia developed out of Ukraine religious-wise. The Orthodox Church in Ukraine had its cradle in Kiev, and then it grew further north. They go back and rely upon that as being their hook back into Ukraine. Ukraine was clearly a country long before Moscow became Russia, but they keep using that hook to come back. Ukraine's been occupied 300 years by Russia, so there's no denying that fact.
What percentage of the population speaks Ukrainian as a mother tongue and Russian as a mother tongue?
As a mother tongue, I think they're in the 40-60 range. I can't recall which way it is, but it's definitely...
Certainly an attempt to Russify the language there.
Well, look, for years they destroyed the Ukrainian language. It was actually banned 47 times in the last 150 years. Ukrainian language either banned, couldn't publish in it, you were arrested for it if you published in it, and so on and so forth. So there's been huge historical problems. But Ukraine has come up on its own. It's a country standing on its own. It's got to make its own policy. Taras was right earlier. I mean, he clearly said Ukraine makes its decisions. They can be influenced by others, but they've got to make their own decisions going forward.
And how would you characterize the state of the health of the Russian-Ukrainian relationship today?
Well, it's very bad because no politician in Ukraine, no matter how pro-Russian he or she could be, would ever satisfy a Russian leader. Viktor Yanukovych in 2010, when he came to power, gave Russia everything that they had demanded. Extension of the Black Sea Fleet, changes on the national identity question, elevation of the Russian language to state level, a whole bunch of things that Russia was demanding. That wasn't sufficient. Russia kept demanding more, and it didn't do what Yanukovych expected Russia to do, which was to change the 2009 gas contract and reduce the gas price. So Ukraine continued to pay the highest gas price in Europe. It was ludicrous. It was importing cheaper Russian gas from Germany. But the reality on the streets is slightly different. The young people on the streets of Ukraine today see A move eastwards, which is potentially what may happen with Yanukovych, would be the reinforcement of what today can be called a thugocracy in Ukraine. This week's edition of The Economist describes it as thieves and thugs only operate in the night. And
let me pick up on that, because you've thieves and thugs, and then somebody else mentioned corruption, I think, earlier in our discussion. And earlier this week, this well-known group, Transparency International, released its 2013 Corruption Perceptions Index. This is a list you don't want to be high on, right? If you're number one on this list, that's not a good thing. Ukraine placed 144th out of 177 listed countries. That sounds not bad, all things considered. If you're 144 out of 177, that means you're well down the list of countries considered corrupt. But describe the nature of the corruption in Ukraine today, Marc.
Corruption is rampant. This is inherited from Soviet days. It just carried over into a quasi, call it a business era of capitalism. So people call it bad capitalism. And basically, I mean, the president and his entourage fight for seats in parliament, in the cabinet. They fight for all kinds of positions to be appointed. They then appoint their cronies down the line, and all of them bring money up to the top by learning all kinds of tricks and rules to funnel all kinds of corrupt money back up to the president and his entourage. And they're forever indebted to him. And that's why there's a huge network built out there. The civil service is huge. The police is huge. Everyone's in on this system who's part of that network, and they can't get out, because once you're in, you're in.
What about the international community imposing sanctions on Ukraine to end this practice? Would that do any good?
developments in Ukraine could potentially get a lot worse and could potentially become bloodshed. That is already being talked about in publications like The Economist and elsewhere. The only way to prevent bloodshed is for Yanukovych to see reason by being pressured upon by his oligarchic allies. He will not listen to the West. The Cox-Kwasniewski Commission of the European Union traveled to Ukraine 27 times and they failed to get through to him. The oligarchs can pressure him. He relies on them. They all live in Monaco, London, Liechtenstein, Paris, most of the year round. They all have their children there. They go shopping there. They have houses there. They have bank accounts there. If they're pressured, which is now what The Economist and elsewhere is talking about, visa blacklists, freezing of bank accounts, they will then pressure Yanukovych to back off. There's no other solution.
I mentioned 22 years ago, Brian Mulroney led Canada to recognizing Ukraine's independence right near the front of the line. Could you characterize, in your view, the current Conservative government's support for what you'd like to see transpire in Ukraine?
Sure.
How strong is it?
I think it's been very good. The Prime Minister's been to Ukraine. He visited prisons where people were held and tortured. He made a point of visiting the monument in Ukraine and had the President of Ukraine go to that new monument with him, as much as the President of Ukraine doesn't recognize it as a genocide. His predecessor did, and the current one doesn't. But the Prime Minister of Canada went there and said, this is a genocide against the Ukrainian people, and I'm going to that monument. And of course, he had to tag along with him. So he's been pretty good about it. Minister Baird is in Ukraine right now. So he's in Kiev right now and was up on stage apparently this morning, and 20,000 people warmly greeted him. They came running from all ends when they heard a minister was there from Canada. So Canada's really taken a leadership role with Western nations in supporting Ukraine.
There are, though, various tipping points ahead, right? We've got an election in 2 years in Ukraine. Between now and then, what are the kind of things you're looking for to see, you know, how this country turns out, essentially?
Sure. Well, I think Taras touched upon the sanctions. They've got to start pressuring the top 10 people in the country. And when the top 10 are under pressure, that'll cascade down. As I mentioned, it's a pyramid, and it goes down very quickly. Mm-hmm. So if you can pressure the top 10 families and stop their families and stop them from getting educated in the West. Why are they in London being allowed to educate their children, yet oppressing people in Ukraine? And sitting beside them in London are the people working as maids under the table, sending money back to Ukraine so their family can pay the bribe to run up back to Kiev so they can send their children out to the highest school in London. I mean, it's insane, the network of money, how it works. So sanctions against the oligarchs, pressure them. And they will feel the pain. Don't hurt the country. Don't put sanctions against the country. Don't put sanctions against the Ukrainian people, but go against the oligarchs. And they will start to fall one after another. When they start feeling the pain, they will divide.
Taras?
I totally agree. The problem is the EU has been very deceitful on this question. At the same time, the EU does not have the same strong due diligence on capital money coming in from Ukraine and Eurasia as the US does. That's why the oligarchs don't travel to the US. And that's why London is jokingly called Londongrad or Moscow on the Thames. There's a huge amount. More money is sent to Western European EU member states and their offshore zones than the entire Ukraine budget each year. Cyprus is the biggest foreign investor in Ukraine. British Virgin Islands is about fifth. Now, of course, that is hypocritical, because if this money is made in a corrupt manner in Ukraine, how is it clean when it arrives in London? And so, yes, the EU doesn't have many levers over Viktor Yanukovych. This is one of the levers it does have. And it's a bigger lever than it has over Belarus, against which there are sanctions. There are no oligarchs in Belarus. There are oligarchs in Ukraine, and they love to live in Western Europe.
Marc, I got 30 seconds left. Let me ask you this, and I don't want to push this comparison too far, but we are a day removed here from the death of Nelson Mandela, who was in jail and became president. Tymoshenko is in jail. Do you think it's inevitable someday that she too will become president?
I think she will. My sense is she will. As Taras said, she's the strongest orator in Ukraine. She has charisma. People follow her, whether they want to or not. They just are drawn to her. She has magnetism, and the three current opposition leaders are so weak versus her that if she were to be let out of prison, they would clearly try to bind under her and form a coalition.
And somehow you think she will get out of jail to do this, to complete this mission?
Not by 2015, perhaps, but on the next round, she'll be out.
Okay. Gentlemen, thanks for your help on this. Taras Kuzio from the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, Marc Shwec, former president, Ukrainian Canadian Congress's Toronto branch. Thanks to you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.